Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first webinar of the Terp Family Fundamentals Webinar series for the 2017-2018 academic year. My name is Kate Belquist, and I am with the Office of Parent and Family Affairs. We're super excited to be hosting the Department of Resident Life today to help talk about how to help your student navigate conflict while they're on campus. So just as a little bit of housekeeping, just want to plug that we do these webinars once or twice a month. The next one will actually be at the end of October, focusing on study strategies. And if for some reason you need to leave the webinar a little bit early today, we will have a recording available on our YouTube site under the name Terp Family, and most likely tomorrow afternoon. And so if you have to jump off, that's okay, and look forward to seeing you all at Family Weekend. And with that, I'm going to introduce our presenters. We have two partners from Resident Life here today. The first, Jordan Adams, who is a resident director of Elkton Hall, and Ray Nardella, who is a resident director of Centerville Hall. And with that, the first thing I know that they're interested in learning is who is in the room. So I'm sending out a poll to everybody to see who is a parent or family member or a student. So if you have a moment, if you could please let us know, and we'll go from there.
All right, well, thank you for joining us this afternoon, everyone. Like Kate said, my name is Jordan Adams.
And I'm Ray Nardella, both from the Department of Resident Life, and we both run spaces that are populated by primarily first-year folks here on campus. So we're excited to talk to you this morning/afternoon about how we could help you help your student.
Great. So as a result of our presentation, we want to provide you all with some context of our philosophy of our roommate mediation process. We would like to give you advice and some resources that you as parents or guardians can tell your student when they do have roommate conflicts that arise in their room. We want you all to understand our process with DRL and our policies around how we mediate conflicts, and we'll break it down on both the RD side and also the RA side and what we have instructed our RA staff to do when conflicts do come to their attention. And lastly, just understanding how the role of the student plays in all of the conflict and the mediation side, the role of the RA, and also the role of the RDs once we get involved in roommate conflicts, and how we handle it, and advice and resources that we're willing to give to you all so that you can tell your students as well.
Absolutely. So I think it's appropriate to start sort of with what roommate relationships look like across the board, and this is regardless of whether or not they turn into disagreements or whether or not they eventually sort of morph into roommate conflicts. Important to go over what what the general progression of the roommate relationship is like. Typically, not unfamiliar to many of you, is the honeymoon phase. So anytime that students specifically start something new, whether that's moving to college for the first time, whether that's getting to know fellow classmates, but specifically in our, sort of for our intents and purposes with roommates, it's the first 2 or 3 weeks of them living together, right? Typically, we notice that they love each other in a lot of different ways, right? They get to know each other, they understand each other's sort of differences, where they're coming from. They're usually off on a pretty good foot. Typically, after the first 3 to 4 weeks, we see some of that honeymoon phase dissipate, and that sometimes could lead us into what a lot of us are known as kind of roommate conflicts and roommate disagreements, right? So after folks understand where they are in the college context and they understand their values and what they sort of believe in when having been at college for a few weeks at this point, we see a lot of differences start to surface. And with those differences come sometimes conflict, right? So typically when we when we get to that point, you might get a call, or somebody in your family might get that dreaded call saying, hey, I'm not really agreeing with my roommate right now, I hate my roommate, or some derivative of that. It's important to sort of listen to the positive comments that come from that conversation. So oftentimes you'll hear after those first 3-4 weeks from your student a lot about their roommate or roommates. And we encourage you as staff members to listen to that conversation from your student, both the negatives and the positives, because we think sometimes it's sort of easy to negate some of those positives, so bringing those back into light is important to really give you a holistic understanding of the issues at play. Again, after that honeymoon phase is over and some of that conflict does start to surface and you get that call and you listen to what they have to say, both positives and negatives, it's also really important to really, really listen, and you'll see later that we really can't overemphasize this concept of listening, because oftentimes what we notice as staff members is that there's a lot of issues that come to the surface, and usually only a few of those issues really service the crux of the conflict. Right. So, for example, if roommates aren't coming back early enough and they're waking each other up and it sort of spirals out of control, sometimes you'll get a call saying those things, but also saying something sort of irrelevant, like, I also don't like the fact that, he drives a Ford and not a Chevy. So sometimes they can really dig deep into things that aren't always relevant. So it's important for y'all to be able to really filter out some of those issues that wouldn't help them solve.
Yeah, and moving past that, we're looking at, when you get this phone call, what does that story sound like? Does this story seem one-sided? An important part for parents and guardians to really recognize is that there are always multiple sides to each story. So for us as RDs, when we do have conflicts that come to our attention, we listen to that one student, we hear their concerns, but also we do reach out to that other student, or if it is a triple or a quad, reach out to the other students to really get their side of the story so that we have a much clearer picture of what's going on within that room. And then also seeing, is your student potentially adding to the issue that may be coming in that room, and having that conversation with them. So a lot of times, in a lot of the minor roommate conflicts that I've seen, there have been a little bit of fault on both ends for both students. So really trying to recognize each behavior and how we want to address it, and understanding that there will be little road bumps, and there may be a few other things that happen, but being able to have that conversation and have that open communication with their roommate is going to be key in solving this issue. And so when I told my parents that I was doing a webinar to speak with other parents or guardians, I asked my dad, I said, hey, I'm doing this thing, I want some advice, what's your advice to other parents or guardians when their student is going through a roommate conflict? And my dad said, you should tell them that they should be asking questions rather than telling them what to do. And so I thought back to my freshman year, back in 2008, or 2009 actually, and I thought back to the first conflict that I had with my first roommate, and I remember being on the phone with my dad, and I said, Dad, I can't do this, I don't want to live with this guy anymore, he's doing this, he's doing that, and my dad pretty much was like, wow, that's unfortunate. What are you going to do about that? And at the time when my dad asked me that, I thought, wow, that's not what I wanted to hear from my dad, with me going through one of the first conflicts that I've ever been a part of outside of, being at home. And so looking back on that experience, following that conversation with my dad, I took it upon myself to go talk to my RA, and then I met with my RD and kind of told them what was going on, and then I had a one-on-one conversation with my roommate, and we just determined that, we may not be best to live together, but what we did, we hammered out our community living agreement. It was called a roommate contract back at my previous institution. but we hammered that out and we really made it work. But looking back to my father's point, I really got it a few years down the road of what it meant to ask rather than telling, because asking it really put the power back to me as the student at that time to really take it upon myself to figure out what I needed to do to get myself in a better situation. And of course, you know, he's always willing to give me advice and kind of tell me what to do. But I think at that point, I was 18 years old. That was really the first time that I was outside of my house, essentially. He really wanted me to learn these skills that I could use moving forward, because he knew that I would be living on campus for all 4 years. He knew that at one point I would be moving in with a partner, those sorts of things. So my dad really wanted to make sure that I had those skills. So that's the best advice that, you know, from my dad and myself as well, you know, that we can tell you all is really to ask your student rather than kind of giving them and telling them what they should be doing. So going back to Ray's point, when you do get that phone call, there are many things that you can ask your student if they've done. Those things include, you know, asking them, have they done their community living agreement, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You can ask, you know, have they tried to talk about the issue that has come up? Have they tried talking about some of the values and beliefs that they each have? And even asking something as simple as, have you tried listening to your roommate? These are the questions that the RAs will ask. These are the questions that our Ds, we will also ask. And so it really helps if we're all on the same plate when it comes to, you know, these are the questions that we need to be having the students ask their roommates, because you all would be surprised of the number of conflicts that are immediately done just by asking, you know, have you tried talking to your roommate about this? A lot of times when I've had to meet with roommates and they say, oh, I have not had that conversation with my roommate about whatever the issue may be, when they come back a week later after the conversation, you know, they say, oh, you know, things have changed since then. That roommate did not know that their behavior was a problem. And that is what we hear a lot of times with a lot of our minor roommate conflicts, that that person just didn't know that it was an issue and they changed their behavior following that conversation.
Absolutely. And it's funny because I always chuckle a little bit at Jordan's story because, you know, as much as we want our students to understand these skills within the context of a roommate relationship or a roommate conflict, it's so important that we're also helping them understand that these skills are so transferable to their life, not only after they stop living with that specific roommate, but even after they graduate UMD, right? Because the reality is, you know, the skills that our staff and the skills that they're learning via their community living agreements, which again we'll go into a bit more in depth later, are things like, you know, conflict management styles and compromising and basic communication skills, which will far transcend just UMD. And that's as simple as, you know, our students being in any type of relationship after they graduate, whether Jordan said that's with a partner or whether that's a professional relationship or a friend group. These skills are going to be so important to be able to not only develop and use now, but also after they graduate. So that's why we really try to make it a point to start that process of developing these crucial skills now so that they could further solidify them as they go on through their collegiate time and really take them into the real world with them when they graduate. We think it's so important. We notice that if the earlier that students start to develop and hone these skills, the more successful they are in relationships down the road. Again, be it roommate, be it professional, or something as simple as being in a group project in a class a few years down the road. And I always share the story. Oftentimes, when folks first hear of a roommate conflict, one of the first things that comes to mind is this very negative and you know, sort of toxic situation that will inevitably tear those two people or those group of folks apart. And that's not always the case. I like to always share this small anecdote. When I was at a different institution a few years ago, I had this roommate conflict, probably one of the worst roommate conflicts I've dealt with in my professional career. And I started the process of mediation, and these two young women just couldn't compromise on anything. So me and my staff at the time really sat down with them and we went through it step by step, and we tried to get them to come to a middle ground, and they ended up leaving being okay with each other, but we didn't anticipate them being best friends. So as the weeks and months go on, they became closer and closer, and I illustrate this story because it's funny. They actually ended up being in each other's bridal parties, which I always laugh at. And granted, that's not always going to be the case. We recognize that, but I tell that little anecdote just to illustrate the fact that roommate conflicts aren't the end of the world, and they really do give our students an opportunity to be able to jump into a conflict situation, which they may or may not be used to at this point, early in their college career, so that they're able to, like I said, learn those skills and really, as Jordan mentioned before, advocate for themselves. We want our students to essentially do this themselves and empower them with the skills and confidence needed to do that.
Great. So when we do have issues that arise in the rooms, we have a few different things that we encourage our staff to do, and also we encourage the students to do. The first is a mediation, and for most of the things that we've seen, especially last year and at previous institutions that we have both worked at, this is usually the ideal first step when it comes to really trying to solve this issue. And that mediation, it could just be that roommate meeting with that roommate. It could be the RA sitting down with both roommates and having that conversation, or at times, depending on the situation, it could be the RD sitting down with those roommates as well. But we do encourage the residents to really try and have this conversation first with their roommates rather than it being one of the RAs or the RD, because like I said earlier, sometimes the issue that may be happening in the room, one roommate may not know that that is a problem until someone actually says that, hey, this behavior that you've been doing, it bothers me when I'm in the room. And sometimes that will just squash the issue and they'll be able to move forward. So like I said, that is the ideal first source of resolution that we will go to in trying to mediate a conflict.
Absolutely. And another option that we have, and we really do want to clarify that this isn't the first resort that we use. So an option that we do have is the room exchange process. So there is a point in the semester where students do have the opportunity to switch their rooms, and those specific dates are delineated by the department, and those are available on our website, I believe. But there is a point in the semester where folks are able to select open spaces and exchange different spaces with other folks. So that's always an option. But what I kind of mentioned a few moments ago is sometimes roommate conflicts do necessitate the resident director or the community director stepping in and administratively moving folks. That happens rarely, and that happens in very specific types of roommate conflicts. But we don't use it as a method of first resort because we don't believe that really empowers our students to be able to utilize those mediation skills that we really want to help them hone. So we say that this afternoon because we want you to know that it is an option. It's not something that's totally off the table, but given a lot of our sort of logistical confines and a lot of our goal, like as I mentioned, of really making sure students are taking the time themselves to solve this first and foremost, we don't use it as the first point of resolution.
Yeah. Yeah, if your student is going, through that mediation, they're at a crossroads, they really don't know what to do, two other resources that you all have available, you can call the counseling center. They have a warm line for parents, and so you'll be able to talk about your student, a little about what they're going through, and they can have that outreach to their student there, as well as calling our community offices. So if your son or daughter is living in our residence hall, they are part of one of our many communities that we have on campus, and you can just go onto our webpage. You'll be able to see all the phone numbers for our community offices across campus, and you can call that number and ask to speak with either their RD or maybe even their community director, and they will be able to get that information out to us so that we can get it out to the RAs so that we can have the RAs follow up as soon as possible. Either the RAs will follow up or the RDs, depending on the situation and the severity of it as well.
Yeah, and the next point is one I always like to talk about, because we, undoubtedly live in a world that's characterized by Facebook and Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat, whatever else the kids are doing nowadays. And I like to bring this up because it's really important that we as, we as parents and guardians and families, as well as students themselves, don't jump to using social media as a platform to either research a roommate or better understand where a roommate is coming from. And there's a few different reasons for that. First and foremost, oftentimes social media doesn't tell the entire story. There's sort of these fragmented stories and these fragmented posts and statuses that folks will often, put in the social media world, and very rarely does that actually give a full and holistic view of where a roommate's coming from or their situation or what's going on in their life. So we really caution our residents and our students to not use social media to dig deep into somebody's past and use that as a platform to when it comes to roommate conflicts. And the other piece of that is a lot of times on social media there's a lot of misconceptions and distorted views, and it really does not it's not conducive to a good resolution. I recall a few years ago at another institution, I was dealing with a roommate conflict, and I got a call from a family member of one of the parties involved in the conflict, and they said, "Ray, this is crazy. This person does this person does drugs, this person does all this crazy stuff." And it actually turns out that that person that they were referring to was a different person with the same name that they had found on Facebook. So that sort of just illustrates the, the craziness that could come along with really using social media as the primary way to solve a roommate conflict. We really like to take the digitalization, if you will, out of that and really put those really genuine and raw communication skills into it. As great as social media could be in a lot of ways in an educational context, typically it's not a great channel to manage these situations.
Great. So when you do get that phone call from your student saying they hate their roommate, they're having these issues, they do this, they do that, where do you go from there? So going back to a point that we made in an earlier slide, does the story seem one-sided? So going back to the point that there are always multiple sides and very different interpretations of what's going on depending on the roommate, the role of that roommate, the role of your student, and if they could also potentially be contributing to this issue. So really understanding that what you're hearing is your student just giving their one side of the story. And like I said earlier, both the RAs and RDs, when we do meet with students, we will meet with both so that we're able to get a gauge and get more clear picture of what's going on, because there are many times in roommate conflicts that we've seen where we get the story from one person and their roommate has a very, very different interpretation of what's going on based on their experience and what they're contributing to this room.
Absolutely. And another point that I want to bring up that Jordan had mentioned before is that it's important to bear in mind that when you are talking with your student and you're listening to them sort of give the explanation of what the roommate conflict is about and all the different issues, it's important to remember that you're chatting with them in a time that's very emotionally charged for them. They're in an emotionally charged state. It's not a matter of, "Hi, how's your day going?" and sort of the routine calls that you might have with your student. It really is, I'm calling my family member to let them know specifically about this, and I have all this anger and this emotion built up. So, we certainly don't negate the fact that a lot of folks are, anxious and nervous when it comes to this, and we want to recognize that as a valid emotion. But it really is important as you all, as supporting structures for your students, to remember that this is a unique time for them. It is a very specifically emotionally charged situation that you're dealing with. So remembering that as you listen to them talk and as you listen to them describe the issues is really important, because that might help inform how you go from there.
Yeah. And next, I would say asking that golden question: have they tried speaking to their roommate about the issue? And if they have tried to have that conversation, asking, well, how did that go for them? How do you feel after having that conversation? And if they haven't spoken to their roommate, asking, why haven't you, ask your roommate about this issue? Why haven't you brought it to their attention? Because sometimes they might need that little push in that direction to go ahead and ask them why they haven't tried to talk to their roommate. I know something that stuck with me from my undergrad is when I was 18, I had first gotten to college. I was a complete introvert. I did not like having these types of conversations. I did not like confronting conflicts. It made me feel very, very uncomfortable. And something that I learned when I went through my first conflict, and something that my RA and a few other people told me, is that sometimes it's okay to be in this state of being uncomfortable with something, but what you're going to see is that in those moments of being uncomfortable and addressing things like this, you're going to have those growth moments where you're able to learn these skills and practice these communication skills and these conflict resolution skills that you'll need moving forward past that. So really encouraging your student to really step up and ask their roommate and have that conversation with their roommate about this issue is key here, because it is something that we will even ask them if it does get to the RD level, asking them, can they talk to their roommate about this? And next, just encouraging them to be honest about the situation, as the parent or the guardian, really making sure that you are filtering out the small issues and really addressing the large issues, and what is really on the plate and what really needs to be addressed is going to be key with being honest there.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Jordan. I appreciate that. And I think that I just actually want to reiterate what Jordan had said about asking your student whether or not they spoke to the roommate. Because folks, I can tell you the great majority of roommate conflicts that I hear on an initial basis, the answer to that is no. Not a preliminary basis, I'm sorry. The answer is no, I haven't spoken to my roommate. And there's different reasons behind that, but it's very important that we're checking in, saying, hey, did you talk, did you have that initial conversation, and really encouraging them to start that dialogue early. So in terms of sort of basic communication skills we want to reiterate before we went into the the next piece of our presentation was really encouraging your student to be honest with themselves, be honest with you. As Jordan mentioned before, are they part of the issue? The answer most of the time is yes, and that's okay, right? That's something that we want to be on the same page with our students, because that will help not only them better understand the context of the situation, but also you. So encouraging that honesty and using those basic communication skills. So one thing that we as professional staff always help our RAs better understand is this concept of using I statements when we talk, and especially in the context of conflicts. I statements, essentially starting a statement with the word I and attaching some kind of feeling or emotion to that. And that's, and as you could see on the presentation, we use that for a few different reasons, one of which is because it's not accusatory. So instead of saying, Jordan, you're horrible because you come back to the room every night at midnight, it's important to say something to the effect of, I feel really tired when you come back at midnight because it wakes me up. It's a lot harder to argue with. It's non-accusatory, and it really does demonstrate that element of genuineness. And it automatically puts both roommates or all three roommates, however many folks are involved in the situation, on a better level to be able to have that conversation to an eventual resolution. So it's important to encourage your students to use I statements when they're talking to their roommates, so that we can be in a good place there. And compromising, right? We all understand that not one person's going to win, not one person's going to lose. That's just the reality of roommate situations. That's not our goal. Our goal isn't to have Jordan have 100% and have Ray have 0%. It's really to come to a middle ground and being able to understand where all of us are coming from, and being able to agree on some things and disagree on others, but live civilly. We don't have to be best friends. We always tell our folks that who we're meeting with, we don't have to be best friends, but we want you to live in a civil way, and with that comes some sort of compromising. And as I mentioned before, listening to your student, encouraging your student to listen to their roommate, listen to their RAs, listen to their RDs is so important. And folks, I always tell my staff there's a difference between listening and hearing. When you hear, it's the process of sound going in one ear and going out the other, and sometimes our students are guilty of that, and sometimes we're guilty of that. That's just part of being human. But really taking the time to actively listen, understand what's being said, and process these facts and these emotions is very, very important. So we ask for your help in encouraging your student to do that.
Yeah, so the role of the RA, the RAs come to campus about 2 weeks before the residents move in for some pretty extensive training on a variety of different topics. But the one that we focus on a lot, especially this year, are really training our staff in conflict mediation and community living. And so what we tell our RAs, and it's what we do as RDs as well, is that we are there to facilitate and structure a conversation. So when we do have those mediations, one of the ground rules that we will set is that we, as that staff member, are not there to really guide that conversation, but really we're there to facilitate it and kind of have some structure and a little bit of order to how that conversation goes. So it should be those roommates, people who are living in that space and that are paying for that space, to really have that conversation to figure out how to make things work and how to compromise and how to see how the other person is feeling. I think Ray really hit the nail on the head when he said, with those I statements, they are so important when having that, and that's something that we guided our staff in, making sure that people are using I statements, and that is a part of the ground rules that we are setting when we are having those mediations.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that and I think sometimes when students come into my office or they go into the RA's room and the RA mediates a conflict, sometimes they expect, give me an answer, right? Tell me what to do. Tell me how to make this right. And again, to reiterate, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I really want to reiterate Jordan's point, because that's not really what we want to do, because we're not living in that space, or we're not paying for that space. They are. So it's our job to facilitate and structure the conversation so they're able to advocate for themselves and they're able to learn those skills. And a lot of that comes, again, with those communication skills like compromising and I statements. We train our staff members, and we also do this ourselves as professionals, to empower our students to solve the issues at hand so they could thrive through a roommate conflict today and a professional conflict tomorrow, and their relationship as they move on in life. One of the things that our student staff do, specifically our RAs, is they have very intentional and specific conversations with their residents regarding their CLA. So Jordan had mentioned before this document called Community Living Agreements, which is a fancy name for a roommate contract. And what we do is we have our RAs go through each space and sit down with all the roommates in that room and answer very specific and structured questions that they really hit on common areas of conflict that we've seen in the past. And they answer those in ways that have to be satisfied by both the RA and the professional staff, so that we're really able to sit down and look at their answers and responses. And we use that really as a mechanism to try to mitigate the conflict that could arise throughout the semester and the year. We think that's really important. And we really do believe that these community living agreements encourage honesty among all parties in the room. We talk a lot about the plausibility of the stuff in those contracts, because it probably wouldn't be very plausible to say that this person can't come in the room for 20 hours out of the day, because that's just not realistic. And we also really try to help the students understand that these could be modified, and those could come in the form of, after a roommate conflict, they could be remodified, or maybe 5-6 weeks into the semester, folks realize that they want to change a few elements of that CLA, they are more than welcome to do that, and the RA and the professional staff are there to guide them. And the good thing is the RAs do have access to see all of these CLAs of their residents, so they can pull them up and go question by question through these and really pinpoint what questions have to be more specific or more thoroughly answered. So we really do reiterate to the RAs that this is a very important piece of that crucial 3 to 6 week check-in time.
Yeah, and like Ray said, we as RDs are making sure that our RAs are checking their database for the CLAs to really see what the residents are putting in there. So I know for me, when I went to all the floor meetings about a week ago at this point, you know, I talk a lot about the CLAs, and I really stress that they need to put everything in these CLAs. Even if it may seem like a common sense type thing, we still want the residents to put that in there. So the examples that I tend to give, I always say, if you're okay with your roommate wearing your clothes without asking, you should put that in there. If you want your roommate to be able to eat your snacks or drink your water, whatever it is that's in that room, you should put that in there, because that's going to be what we refer to when we do have a mediation that we need to do. We're going to pull that CLA up and go section by section and really talk with them about, you know, well, you know, this is listed here. What has changed since then, or what has made you feel more either uncomfortable or, you know, whatever it is with this specific section of your CLA. So that is something that we really do stress. We stress detail. We want to see as much detail as possible. And it's always the rooms that have nearly nothing in their CLAs where the conflict is happening in October and November, where it's kind of at the highest point at that point. So really, when you are having conversations with your students, really asking them about their community living agreement, asking them about how the conversation went with their roommate, asking them if their RA checked in with them, and asking was there anything else that they think they should add, are great things that I recommend you all doing, so that you all kind of know our process, and you kind of know where they stand in their community living agreement process.
Yeah, and again, just to reiterate Jordan's point, one of the first things that we will ask the students is, what is in your CLA regarding this issue, right? So if you're coming to me saying that your roommate is coming back at 2 a.m. every night and waking you up, well, how did you address that back in August and September? Sometimes the answer is, we did address it and they're not complying. And that's something that we'll understand and go from there. And most of the time, not all the time, the answer is, we didn't address it. So we really want to encourage our students to address all those specific things like Jordan was saying. And one final brief point I'll make is that sometimes these issues expand the scope of RAs and student staff. We certainly recognize that, and there are times when the resident director or the community director will have to intervene in a situation if it gets to a certain magnitude, and that does happen sometimes, but typically our student staff are good about handling these and being able to mediate these.
Great. So next is our community living agreement. I know that we've been talking about it the entire time without really showing it to you all. So this is what it looks like. What it is a document that is found on their MyDRL account, and both roommates, or if it is 3 or 4 depending on the living situation, have access to see this, and they all have access to fill it out and also sign it as well, saying that they all agree to it. We can see when they have signed it, we can see where it populates, and we as RDs can also just go through and read every single one for each room in our building. So this will be made public on the website, so you know, we won't go through every single question today, but some of the big things that or highlights that we see here, we do have a section on communication, and that first question just being, you know, what steps will you take to communicate and resolve a disagreement or conflict that arises in that space? So that is a key question. I think it's a great first question, so that's both residents know that in the event that something happens, this is how they're going to go about having the conversation with each other to really figure out how to make this work. So we have a section on communication, a section on cooperation, so that shared space, as far as the temperature in the room, are they going to use the fan, are they going to keep the air unit on, what that looks like, and also what belongings are you comfortable sharing and under what circumstances. So that goes back to the examples that I do give at the floor of meetings of saying, are you comfortable with your roommate eating your snacks? Are you comfortable if your roommate has friends over? Can they sit on your bed? Can they use your things? So really having that conversation will help avoid issues moving forward. And also sleeping and studying, what time do you go to bed? What time do you want the lights off? Will you be using that space as your primary place of study? What are your expectations around that space? Do you expect music to be on? Can music be on? Can the TV be on? So really encouraging the students to really think about it from that angle is really key here.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Jordan mentioned, we're not going to go verbatim through the CLA because you will have access to this information via our website, but we do really try to hit on those common points of disagreement among roommates that, in our experience, usually do spiral into some kind of disagreement or conflict. So cooperation, who can come over, what times can they come over, what times do they have to leave, and then furthering cooperation with cleaning. That's always a big one. We see very frequently that when we do get to the college level in the resident side, the resident life side of things, there are sometimes a clash of personalities, and with that sometimes comes cleanliness versus not so cleanliness or not so organized. So we try to hit on all those. Safety and security is something that we take very seriously here in resident life, and we encourage our students and our RAs to really have those very intentional conversations with each other to agree on things like how you keep your space safe, how you lock things up, make sure you lock your door and the like. So safety is a huge component of that. Moving on, civility, which is, like I mentioned before, we don't expect that every person living in every space is going to become best friends for life, but we do expect that they'll live in a civil way that is, conducive to comfort and to academic success. So civility is important. Alcohol and other drugs, alcohol is strictly prohibited for folks under 21 via our policy and via law, as are drugs. So this is a really good talking point for students to have those intentional conversations with each other. So that's one of the reasons we put those in the CLA. And we really do, on a broad level, want the students to talk to each other about what they feel comfortable with and what they don't feel comfortable with, because at the end of the day, this is the document that's going to serve as the guiding force in a roommate mediation or a roommate conflict. Yeah, and so post-mediation and successful remainder of the semester, because that's always our goal as professional staff and as student staff. We want to mediate this to the best of our ability and allow students that space to be civil and to be safe and to be secure and for them to enjoy the rest of the semester and the rest of the year. So we encourage students to tell each other, under the guidance of staff, what's going to happen if they don't follow these new amendments in their CLA. So after a mediation has been facilitated, it's often likely that the CLA will be amended to incorporate those new things in there. So we have that conversation. If Johnny doesn't, comply with this, what's the accountability piece going to be? So that's a very important piece of that. Helping them understand the skills they've gained and how they can use them in the future. Like we sort of reiterated throughout the presentation thus far, these are skills that are great for today and even better for tomorrow. Checking in with them individually. We encourage you as family and parents and supporting folks to check in with your students to see how they're doing, and that's something that we as staff do as well. Being reasonable about the accommodation, like we always say, it takes time and process to help resolve these, right? We wish that we could wave a magic wand and make this happen, but unfortunately that has not been a technological advancement that society has given us yet. So it really does take time and process to make sure that these come to resolution. And the other thing we say is that one step back doesn't mean it's a failure, and it doesn't mean that the hard work that our students and our residents have put in is just, it goes out the window, right? It's part of life. Like you said, it takes time, so a little sort of step back is not the end of the world.
Yeah, and with that, time and process, like Ray said, is an important part to really focus on. These things just won't happen overnight. It will take a little bit of time, and it does take a while for someone to really change their behavior, modify it, so that it accommodates both people in that space. And really helping your student really understand that you're really proud and happy that they took it upon themselves to really figure out how to resolve these issues, on their own. Because I think back to my first roommate conflict when I was an undergrad, and after I got through it and had the conversation with my roommate, my RA, my RD at the time, my dad talking to me after the fact, saying that he was happy that I was able to really learn these skills that I could use moving forward. And the next year I actually became an RA, and I was the same person telling my residents, my story of my first roommate and how I was able to learn the skills to be able to mediate this conflict, and it was my hope that they will be able to really hear my story, understand that I went from being a person who was absolutely terrified of addressing and trying to mediate a conflict to being more open to having that conversation with others when roommate conflicts or really any conflict in my personal life arose. I was able to really have that conversation. So it really helps reinforce all this whole process if you as family, supporting members of the family are able to really help that student understand that they just did something really big that has a big impact on the rest of their lives based off the skills that they have learned from mediating their conflict.
Yeah, and I think sometimes students don't take it upon themselves to get even to the level of going to an RA or an RD. So I think it's very important that that we do reiterate that we are proud of them. We are happy that they took it upon themselves to want to learn and to want to get these skills.
Great. So now we have some time for a few questions.
Actually, it looks like there are no questions this time. We've been answering this as we go along. You all have done such a fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic job. So excited to have you here today. So at this point, seeing that there are no questions coming in, we are going to close out the webinar. If this is something that you would like to refer to later, maybe your student isn't in conflict yet, but you want to be prepared, we will have a PDF version of the presentation available at terpfamily.umd.edu. And a copy of this presentation will be recorded and posted on our YouTube site. Again, Terp Family, easiest way to find us. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact the Office of Department of Resident Life at 301-314-2100, and they will help you just as good as they can. Thanks so much. Have a good day.
Pretty well.
You all did great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was fun.
Yeah.
I want to do another one.
We sent them the formula for the I statements,
Perfect.
so they all got that. We should have put it in the presentation.
That's all right. No, that's good.
I think it was good to put it in the chat because it opened up.
Yeah.
Sweet. What questions were they asking?
They asked about the time when students had to complete CLA. So I told them that we asked them to do that the first 2 weeks, and that then we encourage them to edit it as things come up over the course of the semester. Perfect. And then the RAs will check in with them. They asked if you all worked with counseling center. Oh, no, with the Department of Resident Life.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah.
Cool. All right.
Cool. Great.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
So
Yeah.
how do you feel?
Good. Yeah.